make sure. Okay. So our last part is the actual Lightning Aura component. We've done all our pre-work. We have our data. We have our Apex controller all ready to go. So for those of you who have not worked with Aura components or are not as familiar, there are several parts to Aura components. These first three are the three we're going to work with today. We're going to use with the component, in which we need to define the parts or the attributes. It's going to handle the display. So this is kind of the view part of our MVC framework. And it uses tagging. So some Salesforce specific tagging, but we can use HTML in it. The controller. So on this case, wait, we already had a controller. This is a second controller. This is our client side controller. It handles our events. It can call our server side controller, so our Apex controller we created. And we can use it to initialize values.
Linda,
Yeah.
you want to share the slide?
I thought I was sharing the slide. Do you see it?
I see your video feed.
Media feed. All right, so let me stop sharing and oh, it's not. Okay, here. Your entire screen there. Apparently it didn't take there. Now, can you see the slide now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So as I was mentioning, the component parts, component, which I just talked about, as well as controller. And then the last part, component part we're going to build is design. And this is great for gathering import to use for the component specific to its usage. So when we put a component in a Lightning page, this is where we can do configuration that would differ between the different records that we put it on. Other parts to a Lightning Aura component include a helper. So typically you'd put reusable JavaScript functions in there that support the controller. It's kind of become a bit of a best practice to do that heavy lifting in the helper rather than in the controller. We're not doing that for this example, but I definitely encourage you to rework this later. Documentation. I'll just note that I probably don't do documentation right, but this is where I put in what the component is, how it's used, how to use it. So especially if I use a design, I will list what do you have to put in that design to make it work. And I also include an update log so I know how it's changed over time. Three more parts to the Aura component are the style. So that's where I can add CSS file to style it. Today we're just going to stick with Lightning Design System, so I'm not going to add my own CSS. The renderer is a component that you can use to modify DOM elements of your page. And then the SVG lets you create custom icon resources to use within a Aura component. So our actual component, when we're going to start it, our first tag is obviously the Aura component tag. We're going to implement several interfaces. We're going to use available for record home, has record ID, has S object. I'll go into this a little more. We actually have to call our controller, so the server side controller. We're going to make it global access up so it can go in multiple places. And obviously then we have a whole bunch of stuff inside and our closing tab. The interfaces, important part. We're going to use available for record home. It makes it available only for record pages. I do have links in the presentation, which I will share out to the actual documentation from the developer pages. We're building this component to display on record pages. That's why we need to include this. We're going to use has record ID that lets the ID of the current record that you are looking at be sent to the component. And obviously we need that to be able to extract the data, in this case, to get the ID of that related account record. We're also going to use has S object name. This lets the component know the name of what kind of S object it is that it's currently on. So if you've displayed it in the account record, it'll say account. If you've displayed it in the contact record, it'll say contact. If you've displayed it in a custom object called my object, it'll be my object __ C. And we want to know if the current object is an account, because we have to handle it a little differently if we're dealing with the actual account record in terms of choosing that ID for our component. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to developer console at this point. I'm going to create a new Lightning component. I'm going to call it sales summary component. I could add a description if I wanted to. I'm going to make sure I choose Lightning record page. That means one less thing I have to type. And because that's where I'm using it. I'm not using it in a tab, not using it in a page or communities or quick action. I'm just using it in a record. It will set up the first part, and you'll see by default, I've already got available for record home. That interface shows up, as does the has record ID. If you recall from our slide, which I will go back one, we also need force has S object name. So we will have to add that. So we just come in here, force has S object. And then we also have to add our controller. Out of habit, I save a lot. So I've already got that piece in. So our first statement is put this back in present mode. So we've taken care of the interfaces. So after we have the OR component tag, the next big thing in our Lightning component is we have to declare the attributes. These are the fields or other things that we're using in the component, both those that we'll have to use in force record data, as well as the ones we actually want to display or pass to the controller. We're actually going to need 9 of them for this component. Our first 2 are the strings that we'll collect ultimately from the design component we need. We have to declare them here before they exist in the design component. The first of these is the API name of the field that has the ID for that related account record. The second is the name of that relationship. The reason I want to get the name of the relationship is so that I can be a little fancy and in the name of my component include the name of the company so that we know for sure we're looking at the data for the right company. That particular relationship name is kind of like what you use in a parent SQL query. So a lot of times for a custom object, it'll be the name of the object __r. But it really depends on how the relationship was set up in the record when that lookup field was created. After that, we have 2 data points that we're going to display, the sum of total spend and total products. We need to be very careful about the data type that we declare. Both of these are numbers. One is a decimal and one is an integer. Just keep that in mind as we go and build these. We'll need a string to actually hold the name of the related account record. So we want that to be in kind of the title of our component to be able to say, hey, this is Burlington Textiles, or this is the University of Arizona, based on the data we have in our either playground or developer org. The next 3 after that are used for force record data. So we need 2 S objects, one to hold the target record and one to hold the target fields, and then a string to just have an error message. And then the last one actually is the ID of that related account record. If you are following in the pre-written code, it is out here. Orlando's highlighted. So you could take all 9, you could type them yourself. I'm more than happy to share. I'm being quick. 34. Making sure I have all 9. So the first one, as I mentioned, is that field for the account. I'm actually giving it a default value, saying it's account __ C as if I was using a custom object. You could just default with straight account. If account ID would probably be the smartest thing to default to if you wanted to default to something other than a custom. The second one is that the relationship field. In this case, for most standard objects, that relationship is just called account. If it was a custom object, I would use account __ R. I'm declaring decimals for my spend in my products. I could use an integer for my products. It just depends on how you're going to format it later. Actually, no, it doesn't. If you recall, in our controller, let's do this the right way. In our controller, we declared it to be a decimal. Therefore, we have to keep it as a decimal here or it won't work. So yes, decimal for both these. The name on the account, because when we go to pull that, it'll be a string. The 3 fields we talked about for the force. Record data, the target records, which I'm calling T record, the target fields, which I'm calling T fields, and the target error, which I'm calling T error. And I'm just giving it a very generic error message that just there was a error on the record obtainment. And then lastly, my ID, which I'm storing as a string. It's better to store it as a string than a type of ID. Type ID and or attributes have some issues where they don't always seem to pass. And yes, I've tried this as an ID and yeah, it failed miserably. Using it as a string worked. So I'm going to come back here to our slides. So we've defined our 9 attributes. Our next piece is force record data. Force record data gives us a way to easily access data from the record assigned to the component using the Lightning Data Service. We're going to kind of talk through the parts of this component. It's a fairly simple component, but it has a bit of complexity. I do have the link here, the documentation, which is very useful. You'll notice their example does not right away show all the pieces that I'm including. The specification gives a lot more detail about what you can include. Obviously, the record ID is inherited from force has record ID. You really do need to include it. Target error, that localized error message if the record can't be accessed. Target fields will be a list of the fields that we're going to reference. Target record is the provided records. Go back to the slide, see what parts I missed. So record updated. So that allows me to put in an actual controller or, for it to do something. In this case, that controller, we're going to create a do init controller. And having the layout type of full means that nothing will be excluded from what I'm showing. Again, on here, you can see no, that's got new record. I don't even see that. All right, there's a little bit more that's not in there as much anymore because I'm doing record updated. I don't see that on there. That's interesting. All right, so we're going to add as the next part of our class that force record data. I'm going to go in here in my components. Down a little. If you don't already know this trick in Developer Console, if you do Control-A, Shift-Tab, it will realign all your code for you. And again, save often. So I have my force record data in. I'm going to check to make sure I matched my field name. So T record, T fields, T error. This is the record ID. Because it has record ID, I can just use that. And then doing it is what I'm going to call my controller once we get to that part, our client side controller. So back to the slide, we've got force record data in. So then the final part is setting up to display the data. So in this case, we're using Lightning Design System to make our output look styled. We're going to use Lightning Card, Lightning Number format. In the past, you may have used the OR output. That's no longer available. And then I'm making sure I use a padding class just so that stuff isn't too close to the edges. So back to my pre-typed code here. It's all this last section. Which I will paste in and then walk through. So I declare my Lightning card right here. I'm going to give it a title. In this case, for my title, I'm going to use that name account attribute I declared up here, plus some text that lets me know it's a sales summary. I could, if I needed to, if I wanted it to break into 2 lines, use a \n, I believe is the correct command, but I'm not going to do that right now. Then I have my 2 pieces of data. I'm using the HTML tag for a paragraph for each of these. I'm using the class from Lightning Design System for a padding, horizontal, saying it's just a small bit of padding. I'm giving it a label, so sum of total spend. And then I'm using my formatted number. I don't know why it went down to a second line. Oh, no. Yeah. There's a lot of these there. It's not down in 2 lines. This one too. So Lightning formatted number, I include the value. In this case, it's my sum spend attribute that I created above. This, since it's a dollar amount, I want to style it after currency so that it will have my $sign and it will have my commas in the thousands position. If you're in a different country and have a different setup for currency, it will adopt that currency setup, provided that's what's set up for your org. For the second field, again, I use a second, and I close out my paragraph and tags them important. I create my second paragraph, same class. In this case, it's my sum of total products. My formatted number, I use the value for my sum products that I declared in my attributes, and I close out my tag. And then I close out my Lightning card tag at the end. And I can save this at that point. And we obviously, you can see we have no errors. So that's the component. First easy part. Or not so easy, depending on your perspective, but the important part, that's the display. Go back to the slides. The second part, and I'm kind of jumping a little bit. I'm jumping to the design because that's the easiest part. And I like to get easy out of the way. So this is where we can get the information specified by an admin for use in our code. In our component, we are actually going to create 2 attributes for the values that we need to collect. As you recall, in the component, we created those 2. We're going to create them in the design attribute now. When we create these, we need to include the name, and it has to match what we put in the OR attribute exactly, and it is case sensitive. We want to put a label. That's something meaning so the admin knows what they're providing you. Very short though, because it actually displays on the screen. And the last thing I like to include is description. It's best to think of this as help text for the field. When you actually place the component on the page, it shows up like help text with the little question mark in a circle, and the admin could then hover over it and get more details about what they're supposed to provide you. So back to Developer Council. To be able to create the design, I just click on it here and it will start it for me. And I'll be able to put in my 2 parts that I need. I'm actually going to just, again, copy them from my provided code. And instead of copying the whole thing, I'm just going to copy the 2 parts I need, and then I will walk through them. I'm going to get rid of this extra space. I don't need it. All right, so my first field, if you don't recall, in my component, in my attributes here at the top, the first 2, mouse will cooperate, account field and account rel field. So in my design, they have those names. The first one I gave a label of account lookup field. And the second one I gave a label of account relationship name. And then in my description, I've given a little more for the user. For the ID, I said list the API name of the field. That is the lookup of the account field. Leave alone if it's on account. So just let the default go. So if I'm placing this component on an account record, I just want to let the default go, because really what I type in here isn't going to matter. You'll see why in a little bit later. For the second one, the relationship name, I say to list the relationship name. I mentioned that if it's a custom field, this is typically __r, and to leave it alone if it's on the account. I'm going to add 1 more parentheses. That looks a little bit better. Not quite, but a little better. And as long as I've given these the names that match what's in my attributes, I should be able to save it without any issues. And that's it for the design component. It's actually a fairly small, if an easy part. We'll go back to the slides. So our next piece is the actual controller. So this is the worker view of our Lightning bundle. This is the JavaScript client-side controller. So as you recall from our force record data that we wrote in our component, we need to call a function called doInit. So in the spirit of Miranda Ragland, who gave a very nice WitDevs presentation about building and coding by taking baby steps, I'm going to break this down into baby steps. We're going to start with what S object type the record is. We're going to check that. We're going to get the name of the account field, depending on what the S object type was. Obviously, if it is account, we already know. We're going to get the value of the account ID. We're going to pass that account ID to each of our Apex controller methods to get back the data values we need. And as a last little add-on here, we're going to get the relationship name and use that to get the name of the account that we're working in. Obviously, if the S object type of the record is account, we still need to get the name, but we don't need to use the relationship name. So I've broken this down by each of those steps. So the first one, checking what S object type this is. We're going to use the JavaScript var, so a variable. We're going to call it oname, so object name. And we're going to use component get. So from the component, we're going to go out and get the value of S object name. So I'm going to put that line in. And I'm again going to all right. Sorry, I'm copying and pasting this too, just because. So I want to make sure I declare the right function name. Take this a little bit. So In my developer console, I click on controller to open my controller. You'll see it by default creates the start of an action. I'm actually going to replace this action with one I'm calling do init. Everything else to that line is the same. I'm declaring that first variable of oname, which I'm using component get to get the S object name from the component. I could use, so console log is a great way to be able to see how things are running. If you open the developer tools in your browser, I'm going to leave it commented out for now, but if I were running it, I could then see those comments if I needed to debug. Notice when I hit return, it stays in comments, so I might have to take that out when I'm ready to do my next line. So back to the slide. So the next things I need to do is I need to look, is this an account object? If it is, I need to get the record ID. If it's not, I need to get the name of the account field. So if we're in the no situation, I need to get that name of the account field. So I'm going to use, again, another variable. I'm going to call this fname for field name. I'm going to use a component get to get my account field. So we do this, we're actually going to use this and pass it to the target fields in force record data so then we can get the account ID. So to get the value of the account ID, if this is the account object, we're going to get our value that we're going to get, our variable value, is going to just be the record ID. If it's not the account object, we're going to set the T fields to be T fields plus that field name that we have to go get. Then the value is going to be component get of T fields. Finally, within the step, we will set the component for the account record ID to be that actual ID. I will go back to the code, fill out this last part, and then walk us through it, along with my extra code. So, as I mentioned already, we already talked about grabbing oname, which is the object name. I'm going to make sure I grab the field name, which is from my design, so the account field. So we're in here, if I remember, in my design, I created a design attribute called account field. That's where I'm ultimately getting it from. I can use console log to show that I've got it. If I need to troubleshoot, I could uncomment that. Then I'm going to check, is my oname, is that equal to? Remember, for setting values, you use a single equal sign. For comparison, you use 2. I'm going to check, is it equal to account? If it is account, I'm going to set another variable called value. I'm going to use component get and just get the record ID. If it's not, so my else condition, I'm going to create a variable called T field. I'm going to have it equal to the concatenation of T field, v.tfields dot, and then the name that I got up here from my account field. Again, I can create a console log if I need to debug to be able to see that. Finally, within this else, I will set the value, because obviously when I'm all done, I need to have a value with component get, and I will throw T field, the T field value I created in that. That's what I'm sending. I can use a console log to make sure I'm getting back a value and that it's the right one. And then finally, I'm going to go back and set it. I'm going to tell my component that I want this account record ID to be this value. First part done. Yay. So that is actually the first kind of 3 baby steps that we defined. My next baby step is to actually call the Apex controller method, get back the data values we want to display to the user ultimately. So for this, we need to get the Apex controller method. So we're going to create a variable action. We're just going to call it action. We're going to get, in this case, we use C for the controller. And we're actually giving it the name of the method. So then we have to use this variable call to action we created, and we have to give it some more information. So if you recall, our Apex controller requires a parameter. So we're going to set params. The parameter name in the method was called related account, and we're going to pass it value. So this is the same value we created a little while ago within our controller. We're going to set the callback. So we're going to set the callback using, again, action set callback, this function. If we're going to check the state of the resulting call, if it's success, we're going to set in the component the sum spend for our first one, and we're going to take the return value from the method. So we set all that up, and then we actually run the method by enqueuing the action. And we'll have to do all these 4 steps again to grab the other variable as well. So I will pull a code for this, paste it in, and then walk you through. So after I've set the value, I'm going to paste in this bit of code. I'm going to tidy it up a little. I'm going to give myself a space between there. So I'm declaring a variable in my controller of action. I'm using component get to call my method in the controller. I'm setting a parameter so I can actually pass that parameter in the action. I'm setting a callback so I can say, hey, when it comes back, this is what you're going to do. If it's successful, you're going to get the state. You're going to check if it's successful. And if so, you're going to set my sum spend that I declared in my component. In case you don't remember, in my component, under attributes, I've got a field sum spend, and my other field is sum prods. I'm going to set sum spend to that return value. And then I come here and as a separate stud, I fire it and say, go do it. So that will have run and it will have populated that field. I need to repeat this whole set of action to get the second field, my sum prods. I'm going to have to use different variable names. So to save me time, I copy paste. I'm just going to call it action 2. So everywhere I have action in here, I'm going to change it to action 2. And this time, instead of get tote spend, I want to run my other method, which, to remind myself, is called get tote prod. So instead of spend, it's going to be prod. I'm still passing related account because that was the parameter I used right here. But on my callback, I don't want to set sum spend. I want to set sum prods. So I will change this to prods. I'm still using the return value because what I want is the return value from this action. And I'm wondering if I did this here. Did I change that? Yes, I did. So just to make sure it doesn't get confused, since I have an A above here, I'm declaring this one to be A. I'm going to change this to A2 and everywhere I call it. So the A2 state and the A2 get return value because it's all related to the second run. So I have both calls. I'm populating both of my summary fields. But I'm not quite done. I'm almost done. I'm going to save what I've got so far. Go back to the slide. So we've completed passing the account ID to our Apex controllers and getting back the values. Our last baby step is to get the relationship name and to use that to get the actual name of the account. So kind of like we did with the conditional for account ID. We're going to check if it's an account object. If so, we're just going to use BT field's name to get that particular name value. So we're actually kind of making a second call to our force record data. If it's not the account object, we're going to set T field this time to be T field name plus that relationship name and ending with name. So the relationship name kind of comes in the middle this time of our T field. And then we pass it to get that actual name field. And then finally, we will set in the component the name of the account field. So again, taking some nice pre-written code for us. Developer console. Walk through this. So I'm calling this one R field because it's the relationship field name. And again, I'm using component get. I'm getting this account relationship field. This is from our design. This is the second field of our design. I'm calling back. I'm checking if that original field, so that O name that we created our very first step in this action in our controller, is account. I'm using just a default value or the regular value to get the name field. So I'm just sending it BT field's name. So just the object that we're on, I want to get the name field. Otherwise, since I'm not on account, I want to pass b.t fields. I want to put in the middle the R field, in this case, whatever the relationship is. And I want to end it with .name because I'm always going to get the name from that record. I've got in here a console log so that if I needed to troubleshoot, I could to see what I'm really getting back. And then I'm going to take and set my name value to be the component that I get when I pass this long string. I have another console log to make sure the name value I got back is correct, no matter what type of object I'm on. And then I'm going to set name account. Name account, again, is the attribute I created in my component right here, the string. And if you recall, I also used it in my lightning card, so name account. So here I'm going to set my name account to be that name value I got back. I'm going to save this, and that should be the end of setting up my controller. So we're getting close to the end. Finishing up the code, we want to make sure we've saved all our code. We're going to have to go out now back into Salesforce. We're going to go to one of the accounts for which we loaded sales data, sales summary data. We want to make sure we start from that account so that we'll have something to look at. We're going to click on one of the contacts for that account. If there isn't one, feel free to just create one really quick. We're then going to edit the page, clicking the gear icon and then edit page. We're going to locate the sales summary component that we created. If it does not show up, it could be that you do not have my domain turned on, or I don't know what other possible troubleshooting there is. If someone doesn't have it show up, when you get to the stage, let me know, and I will help troubleshoot as best I can from far away. But I'm going to get that component. I'm going to drag it into the right-hand column. I'm going to check the design elements to make sure the values are correct. If I'm on account, my account field, master detail field in contact is called account ID. And the relationship is just called account. If I'm on, it doesn't matter whether it's a master detail or a lookup field, it can be either. If I was on opportunity, again, that field is called account ID and the relationship is called account. It's pretty consistent for standard items, but for custom items, it might be different. Then I'll need to save the page. I might need to activate it if it hasn't been, and then I should be able to view the record. As always with Lightning, sometimes things take a little while to show and you have to refresh it at the time. So I'm going to go back to my org. I'm going to click on an account record. I know that Burlington Textile should have quite a bit of summary data. I'm just going to check really quick here. And I see there is summary data. I have records. I could, if I wanted to, I could edit the page layout and the related list to show some of the summary data so that I'm not just looking at the ID or the auto number field. But this is all I really need at this point. I'm going to go to this contact. I actually have a contact on here. So Jack Rogers, I'm going to open his record. I can see that my page is kind of boring. It doesn't have my summary numbers yet. The sales manager is still yelling at me that he wants to see them. So I'm going to edit my page. I'm going to choose edit page from the setup, the gear icon, which takes me into the Lightning page editor. On the left, I'm going to look for my component. Extra windows. Scrolling down to the custom components, and I can see my sales summary component. I'm going to drag it over to my top right, paste it in. Notice it's already populating for me. But if I look here, I know that my account lookup field is not called account. It's called account ID, so I'm going to fix that. I know that my relationship is account. And remember when we built the design component, I had you put in a description. You notice up here, if I hover at the little I have the text that I put in that description. Very useful for an admin who might not be as familiar with the component that you've built for them. I'm going to save my page layout. I need to activate it because I haven't before. So I'm going to click activated. I'm just going to make it the org default for all layouts for now. And hit save. And I'm going to go back. And voila, I have my data. Obviously, my title is a little long and it's cutting off. So I probably wanted to do that /n and or figure out what I need to do multiple lines. But it's working there. If I want to check a different record just to make sure it's not a fluke, I can come here. So I know I created some data for Dickinson PLC, and I can check that I have data. I have 3 summary records, and I have a contact. I can go to that contact. And again, I see it. It shows Dickinson, so I've got the right company name. And I've got data. I could go back and do some calculations to make sure the data is right. But we seem to be working.
Very cool.
So back to my slides. So we've finished that. So if you've been following along and you've kept up, if you're still a little bit behind, that's okay. But once you get it on there, congratulations. You've built a Lightning or a component with RecordData. Cody is here on this slide to give you a high five. And then, of course, where do we go from here? Once we've built this, great, we've built it. Obviously, for me, this came from a use case I had in my current job. But where can you go from this? Becoming a better coder is all about refactoring. So there are plenty of ways to refactor this code. I'm not by any way saying this is perfect. You could move, from what I just gave you, you can move the calls in the Apex controller, or the calls to the Apex controller, into a JavaScript helper. You just have to be careful about what you need to include in the parameters when you're calling that helper. That's what I learned from doing it myself. You could add more style. You could style this yourself. You don't have to necessarily use the Lightning design system, or you could expand upon it. So you could, add that style component. You could work on reworking the Apex controller, and then ultimately you'd have to rework the Lightning component as well, but for increased reusability. So could you set it up so that your Lightning component recognizes the object and then passes that as one of the parameters to actually call up, so you could say, hey, this is the object, this is the field I want to sum, and maybe I could sum or I could average. So you can utilize object schema and an Apex controller to really make this do a lot more. And then, of course, since Lightning Aura components are a little old now and Lightning Web components are the new big thing, could you create a Lightning Web component that utilizes possibly the existing controller we have and shows the data the same way, but could potentially make it visible outside of your org if you needed to. So as in all things, let's just see together, and thank you for letting me present this content. I'm going to close down the recording and the presentation and open it up to any questions.